So a very good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory. What a great honor to stand among you at a time when the conscience of the nation is about to be enriched by one of the most important reports of our time. There is no greater test of the conscience of a people than the way that it treats children. And we are so honored today to have Justice Murray Sinclair amongst us, to share with us the truth of our collective history and the promise of a better future for all Canadians. So thank you very, very much for attending. My name is Cindy Blackstock, and I am so honored to be an honorary witness with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I'm an associate professor of the University of Alberta and the director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, and also a very proud member of the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences. We're looking forward to a great week here in Ottawa. This is the first of the Big Thinking Lectures, and there are many more to come. And we'd like to thank our hosts here at the University of Ottawa, the Algonquin peoples, and also like to remind you that this lecture will be conducted in English. For those of you who wish to have translation devices, they're available at the front counter. I'd also like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Universities of Canada, and the Canada Foundation for Innovation for sponsoring the Big Thinking Speaker Lecture, and thereby helping to host these important events and begin these important conversations vital to Canadian society and to everyone in this room and in the world. The Big Thinking Lecture allows us to engage in the questions of our time, to really, as the national anthem says, to stand on guard, to ask ourselves what it really means to be a human being in this society and what it truly means to be a citizen. And today is no exception. I'd like to invite Ted Hewitt, President of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, to introduce Justice Murray Sinclair. Ted.
Thank you, Professor Blackstock. Bon après-midi, collègues. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Honored guests, my name, as you now know, is Ted Hewitt. I'm president of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to Congress and to this afternoon's introductory Big Thinking Lecture. This event will take place in English, as was mentioned, however, with simultaneous translation available. It will be followed by a panel discussion, and a very lively one, I am sure. Our speaker today, as you know, is the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. His talk will explore an issue of ongoing and pressing concern: what do we do about the legacy of Indian residential schools? This question is particularly important to SSHRC. As a funding council, we've long stressed the importance of proactively supporting and promoting Aboriginal research, as many of you know. In fact, as one of the 6 challenge areas we are exploring through our Imagining Canada's Future initiative, we are asking specifically how the experiences and aspirations of Canada's Aboriginal peoples are essential to building a successful, shared future. We believe that by stressing an approach by, for, and with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, Aboriginal research can be more effectively mobilized to help Canadians understand the current historical, cultural, social, and economic situation in which we find ourselves, and to inform the creation of a vibrant, shared future. With that in mind, it is a great pleasure to introduce to you the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair. In Ottawa to preside over the historic release of the Commission's final report, Justice Sinclair will discuss the legacy of residential schools and offer a call for action towards reconciliation in Canada, including the role of universities in this process. L'Honorable Juge Murray Sinclair a été nommé juge en chef adjoint.
Murray Sinclair was appointed head judge of the Provincial Court in 1998 and the Court of the Queen's Bench in January 2001. He is the first native occupying a justice position in Manitoba. He was born and grew up in the Selkirk area north of Winnipeg. At the end of his high school in 1968, he was appointed Athlete of the Year and was designated to pronounce a speech on the status of classes. So in Manitoba, he went to the University of Manitoba and University of Winnipeg. In 1979, he obtained his degree in law from the University of Manitoba.
In 1980, in the course of his legal practice, Justice Sinclair practiced primarily in the fields of civil and criminal litigation and Aboriginal law. He represented a cross-section of clients, but by the time of his appointment was known for his representation of Aboriginal peoples and his knowledge of Aboriginal legal issues. Shortly after his appointment as Associate Chief Justice of the Provincial Court of Manitoba in 1988, Justice Sinclair was appointed Co-Commissioner along with Court of Queen's Bench Associate Chief Justice A.C. Hamilton of Manitoba's Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. In November 2000, Justice Sinclair completed the report of the Pediatric Cardiac Surgery Inquest, a study into the deaths of 12 children in the Pediatric Cardiac Surgery Program of Winnipeg's Health Sciences Centre in 1994. Le Juge Sinclair a reçu un prix national d'excellence.
Justice Sinclair received a National Prize of Excellence in October and several distinctions for his community services and honorary degree from the University of Manitoba of Ottawa and St. John's College. He is an adjunct professor in law and at the Faculty of Higher Studies at the University of Manitoba.
The Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair. Sir, they are more than ready for you. It was nice, though, to be here and share the applause because I have a gift, something to share with you in advance of your talk, to thank you for being here today and for sharing your thoughts and your experiences with us.
Very good. Thank you. Very good. Bonjour, Zakanastuk, Mizanigijik, Ndijinikas, Kegododem. In my language, I greet you. I tell you that my name is Mizanigijik. I am of the Fish Clan. I'm married to a Bear Clan woman. I'm always under threat. I also want to acknowledge your applause at the beginning, and thank you very much for that, although my assumption is that you're thanking the headdress that I'm wearing here, acknowledging that. This is a very unusual device for me. I've never worn one before, so I hope that it doesn't either rip off my ears or fall on the floor, because I have no idea how it's going to work. So I appreciate your attendance here. I appreciate your participation and your dedication to the work that you do, because your attendance at the Congress is a very singular, significant statement about how important the work that the Congress is doing in advancing the issue of studies and academic focus, particularly on Aboriginal issues, is becoming. And your presence here today, I think, is an indication not only of the work of the Commission, but generally the work that needs to be done around understanding and appreciating Aboriginal issues better as we go forward. I want to thank the people of the Algonquin Territory for welcoming us here as a commission and for allowing us to conduct our final event here in their territory. And also would like to thank the University of Ottawa for hosting this Congress and for allowing me to be back here once again. Years ago, I was presented with an honorary degree from this university, one of the first that I received. And I always enjoy coming back from time to time just to see if they put a new coat of paint on the place. And also to engage with the students. I love engaging with students. I'm sure those of you in the academic community can say the same thing, because that's what keeps us alive, is their curiosity and their need for learning and understanding. And in particular for us to be challenged by them, because their questions, particularly from young Indigenous students who are beginning to ask more and more the four very important questions that we all need to address, particularly the one about where do we come from as Indigenous peoples, really are important questions for all of us to try to help them come to terms with. I am here to talk to you about some of the work that we have done at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and in particular to address the question of reconciliation from the perspective of what do we do about this? Where do we go from here? What is it about the history of residential schools that will give us some lessons for the future? And so I have a PowerPoint slide, which I will totally ignore as I go forward, because I've learned from academics that you should. They're not here to read what's on the screen, they're here to listen to your voice. So every once in a while I'll click to the next one. I may not get through them, but don't worry, I'll eventually say what it is I want to say to you. But before I talk to you, I want you to listen to a survivor, because nothing will make you understand residential schools and the importance of reconciliation more than listening to what a survivor has to tell you. It's like trying to impart to you how difficult it was being in an accident. And some people might appreciate that just from the words of the person who was there, but you never really fully appreciate it unless you've actually been there. And the closest that I can do for you is to bring you into the room with the survivor and have you listen to what it is that he has to say. And so I have a video of a survivor's presentation that was made to us at our national event in Inuvik, far northwest corner of Canada, when we were there celebrating with the people of the Northwest Territories their healing journey as they went forward dealing with the experience of residential schools. In Inuvik, they had two residential schools actually sharing the same yard. At one end of the yard was an Anglican residential school, on the other end of the yard was a Catholic residential school. The Inuit children went to one of the schools, the Dene children went to the other of the schools. And the playground was a war zone between them. And as a result of that, there was a great deal of sadness and a story about the fact that they never really came to appreciate each other very well while they were there. But more importantly, those who had to stay at those schools never got to go home very often because of the distances involved and the cost of transportation, so the parties said. They had no trouble transporting them to the schools. They didn't really want to spend any money transporting them back from the schools, though. The person you're about to listen to is a fellow by the name of Paul Vudrak. Paul is a senior official with the Northwest Territorial Government, and who was involved with us because as a matter of respect, we honored the request by the Northwest Territorial Government to obtain a permit to do research on Indigenous people in the Northwest Territories. And so it's a law, it's a territorial law that people doing research, I'm sure many of you know that, have to get a permit from the government, and they get to supervise your work to make sure that you're not abusing your authority or your rights as a researcher, your relationship with the ones you are researching. And so we applied for, obtained the permit, and one of the people assigned to monitor the work that we were doing was Paul Vudrak. Paul traveled with the commission throughout the 20 communities that we attended in the Northwest Territories. We also went to other communities in Alaska, in the Yukon and Nunavut. And he was there for much of the testimony, and he was there when we were listening to survivors talking to us at the national event in Inuvik. And he didn't speak about his experience until the last day of the national event in Inuvik. And when you listen to his story, perhaps you can get an appreciation for why. The depth of the things that he spoke about are not all revealed on this video because a great deal of his experience is probably far too difficult for most people to listen to. But having said that, he revealed enough, and with his permission and consent, is allowing us to use this video as an educational tool for others to learn from survivors. So allow me to present to you Paul Vudrak, and then I will talk a little bit about what it is that he's telling us. Let me see if I can. Get this started. There you go.
I thought I would be brave to face the demons that haunted me for 49 years. But I see today and since Monday that it still affects me for the things that happened through the 49 years that I kept hidden in me. I left home, and I didn't know why or where I was going, but I went into a plane with my sister and brother back in 1960, 62, 61, 62. And then we came to this building that used to sit across here. And then they separated us. I don't know why they separated us, but like stories I've heard, their clothes were taken, mine was taken as well. My parents bought me some clothing before I came to Grolier Holland. It was taken from me and I had to wear what they had given to me. My winter clothes also was taken. Never did see them again. After our separation from my sister and brother, I wasn't able to speak to them again. My mom come to visit me at one time and I couldn't even see her. And I was taken from my bed with my mouth covered and I don't remember going into the room, his room. I developed a scab between my crotch from below my belly button right down through my inner thighs. I don't know how long I was like that, but I had to walk with my legs spread. And I was too scared to go see the sister, the nun, or the nurse, because I didn't know what to say. Somehow it got healed, but I carried that sexual abuse and assault for 49 years. And that's what impacted that not the residential school, but the person impacted my life until I was 49. My first wife passed away in 2007. She never even knew about this. But I contemplated suicide in 1989. But it's by the grace of God that I sit here today. It's by the grace of God that He stopped me from going to the rifles in the porch when I was going to it. And I stopped. I thought, what are my children and my wife is going to say? How are they going to live seeing their dad dead in the porch? I no longer live by the number 142. I'm Paul Vudrak, and I have the right to live. And I have the right to be happy because I know I deserve it. And my children, if they can hear me, they have the right to come say, Dad, we didn't like what you did. And I can say I know and I'm sorry. And I thank this gathering here for listening to my story. It hasn't been an easy road, but we're not alone in it. Thank you.
I think it's really important that survivors have the courage to tell their story to this commission. Sure, we're still emotional, but they become less and less the more you talk about it and you deal with people who can help you in that field, that that the abuse that you suffered, eventually you're going to have to let it go.
Through these type of events with a lot of support and stuff like that, we can share our stories, we can begin healing, and maybe that's why I turned out to be the person the way I was. I don't think I was the best parent. That kind of hurts. Those things are the ones that are painful.
Well, as you can see, the pain of the survivors is apparent in everything they have to say about the schools. There's very little about what Paul said that we didn't hear from others as well. It's because I don't run PCs, how do I get this slideshow to start? All right, my beautiful assistant, Cindy, will take care of that. Thank you. The commission, just to tell you a little bit about that, because I'm sure many of you know this already, but it bears repeating. The commission is like no other commission that's ever been created in Canada, because we weren't created by the government because the government had a political problem they had to deal with. We were created because the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which the government signed in order to settle the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, required them to appoint commissioners, but the mandate from the commission came from the agreement and not from the government. And so there's a schedule to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement which provides the full mandate for the commission itself. And so it's from that mandate that we drew upon in order to develop the work plan for the commission. One of the weaknesses in the mandate for the commission was there was no definition to the word reconciliation. It wasn't very clear to us what the parties meant when they put the commission together. They certainly defined the truth-telling process. They limited us in terms of what it was that we could do. They said we could go here, we could listen to that, we could allow people to testify, we couldn't allow them to name names, we couldn't designate that certain people had committed wrong unless they'd already been convicted or held liable by a court. We were told that we had to protect the privacy of people who had not yet been named in a public forum. So the whole process of the truth determination process was defined pretty thoroughly in the mandate of the commission. But when it came to what did they mean by reconciliation, there's nothing. So we started off by looking at the definition of reconciliation. And so after that interesting little exercise was completed, we had 130 some different definitions for the word reconciliation sitting in front of us. And of course, if you're an accountant, you know reconciliation is making sure one column is equal to the other column. And if you're a banker, it means the same thing. For lawyers, it's about, are you guys going to sleep together like man and wife or not? Because that's the question that every divorcing couple is asked. Is there any possibility of reconciliation in this relationship? If you answer that wrong, you don't get a divorce. And the wrong way is to say, well, yes, it's possible. You have to say no possibility of reconciliation. And then you can get your divorce. So reconciliation has different meanings depending on the context of things. And so we had to develop some time working out what we thought was a proper focus on what reconciliation meant. And once we did that, then we realized that reconciliation is very contextual, because for people working in government and for people working in the churches, they had one view about reconciliation. It was all for Aboriginal people to do. They had to do all the reconciliation work. They had to heal. They had to get over it. They had to be able to move on. And that was their view of reconciliation. They had to reconcile, not us. And yet for the survivors, when we asked them, what is it that reconciliation means to you, they would say things like you heard Paul Vudrak talk about. I want to be able to talk to my children. I want to be able to tell them, I'm sorry. I want to be able to ask them to forgive me. I want to be able to tell them that this is why this happened to me. That I want to be able to say to them, it's not my fault. I want them to understand why things are the way they are. So for survivors, reconciliation is a whole different issue. It's about being able to establish a proper and meaningful relationship with their children. It's about forgiveness. It's about part of their healing journey, but in a different way than the parties originally might have intended. Now, reconciliation was a phrase that we had to come to terms with and address as we went forward. But in order to have the conversation about reconciliation, we knew this right from the beginning, and that is we had to tell the full and complete story of residential schools as much as possible. And so later on next week, when we release some of our findings, or our findings from the truth determination process, and we talk about what we're going to say about reconciliation going forward, you will see some of what I'm going to talk to you about here today. Just a couple of things that Paul also mentioned that I want to emphasize for you was children who were taken away from their families and placed in residential schools were demeaned from the beginning. And they were treated as though they were subhuman, in some cases non-human. He refers to the fact, for example, when he says, I am no longer number 142. 142 was his number in residential schools. Every residential school student was given a number when they arrived, and that was how they were referred to throughout their residential school stay for the most part. Because a lot of them came to the schools with Indigenous names in Indigenous languages, particularly the Inuit children. And so government policy officially for Inuit people was that they had to be referred to by a number. So the children in the people on the east side of the Northwest Territories, what is now Nunavut, were given an E number. People on the west side and what is now the Northwest Territories were given a W number. And then when you went to a residential school, they gave you another number. So all of that led to great confusion when it came to the settlement compensation process. And we've heard many complaints about that. But more importantly, he refers to the fact that while he was there, he was always referred to as number 142. And so that's just part of the dehumanizing process that they were all put through when they arrived in the school. He talked about how the clothes were taken away. He talked about he couldn't talk to his brothers and sisters. He wasn't allowed to speak to his mother when she came to see him. All part of the separation of the child from any potential cultural or language contact. Language was prohibited in the schools, culture was prohibited, and they were all told that they were to speak a different language and move forward into a different culture. Residential schools were with us from the early 1880s, late 1870s, until 1996, when the last residential school closed in Canada. So they were around for about 125 years. If you think about that, it's about 7 generations of children who went through the schools. And I've pointed out that I think it's probably true. Those of you who are experts in the field can give me your thoughts later if you wish, but if the schools had only been in place for 1 or 2 generations, they wouldn't have had the impact that we're now seeing. because the children would have been able to go back home and they would have had adults and others in their lives who would have been able to help them to heal from that experience. There would have been culturally strong people and leaders in the community that would have helped them recover from this. So if the schools had only been in place for 10 or 20 years or 30 years maybe, but the schools were in place for 125 years. So that eventually, by the time children were going back to their communities, they were going back to their communities filled with residential school survivors who themselves had been through the school system and who themselves had suffered as a result of being in the schools. Those schools were all about education, they say, but actually we point out in our report, oops, I'm not supposed to tell you what's in the report. We might point out in our report that actually there was no curriculum in the schools until the 1940s, after the Second World War. Teachers were not required to be certified. There was no standard for how education was to be delivered. Children were taught basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills in the morning, and then they had to work for the schools in the afternoon, so they were really a source of forced labor for those who ran the schools. But we think that because residential schools have caused much of the problem, people have tended to say education is no longer relevant and we need to rethink the whole process. We think that education actually holds the key to the future, because it's through education we're going to be able to change people's attitudes about things. The settlement agreement identified that there were about 80,000 people who attended those schools that are listed in the settlement agreement. So the agreement only listed a certain number of schools, about 137 originally, 2 more were added through court actions, but in reality there were about 1,300 and some schools that Aboriginal people attended from the period of 1880 until the residential schools started to close down in 1969. 37,000 of those 80,000 claims are made for claims of personal injury that occurred within the schools. Not all of those claims for injury have yet been validated, so that remains to be done. But within the schools, we can tell you that there is a consistency in what children have told us. There's always a discussion about how it was a fearsome place, that they lived in fear, they lived in loneliness, there was hostility towards them, they were oppressed, and they were institutionalized for such a long time. And so we have to look at the way that the schools impacted the lives of those who went to the schools, as well as those who lived with those who went to the schools. So we have to keep in mind that we're talking about the direct impacts on the survivors themselves and the indirect impacts on their children and grandchildren. And for those of you who are keen about looking at this from mental health, and I'm going to talk about some of those findings, I commend this study to you from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation research series, where they actually looked at the mental health profiles for some survivors. And they pointed out the common factors among all survivors who went to the schools: how young they were, how disparaged they felt while they were there, separated, isolated from their families and from their communities, and institutionalized for long periods of time. All of the children who were in the schools were demeaned from their moment of their arrival. They were told that they were heathens and pagans and dirty and inferior people. Savages was a word that was frequently heard, even in the public schools. Those of you who attended public schools in Canada in the 50s and 60s all heard about Father Jean Brebeuf, right? We all know what happened to him because of those savage Indians who did that terrible thing to him. Language and cultural traditions and practices were prohibited within the schools, and people were physically punished for speaking their language. We've heard many stories about that. And there's a lot of directions listed in the documents that we've been able to uncover, which talked about that. Siblings were separated, as I said, because they didn't want children to be passing on their own language to each other. And boys and girls were separated from each other. Some of the funnier stories we heard from survivors were about how, despite the prohibition on contact between genders, they still managed to sneak away in the middle of the night and go find a place where they could have their moments. Talked to a survivor from Spanish Ontario. They can tell you where at the Spanish school they used to go. But visits were limited. Parents were not allowed to come to the schools. They had to get a pass from the Indian agent in order to come to the schools, and they weren't allowed passes if the government felt that there was any risk that the children would be taken away. And children ran away from the schools in large numbers. And within the schools, we've identified through the documents that physical abuse occurred frequently. There was lots of sexual abuse. About half of the children who've claimed for personal injury have claimed for sexual abuse of some kind or other. Some of them, and if you combine the physical abuse and sexual abuse, the number goes up even higher. Children were neglected. Children died from the neglect as well, and diseases were rampant throughout the school system. Dr. Peter Bryce wrote in his report in the early part of the 20th century about the death rates within the school, the number of children who were dying just from a sampling of the schools that he looked at, all pointing out that disease was because of the way the schools were built and the inadequacy of the nutrition programs. So the impacts upon the survivors who were there were upon their immediate sense of well-being. They were victimized. They were angry, not only angry at the people who were victimizing them, but they were also angry at their parents. And so there was a disconnect back to their families and back to their communities. They were afraid to tell people what was going on in the schools, because if they did tell people, they weren't being believed, either by people at the schools or even by their families back home. And sometimes even if they were believed, their parents would tell them, don't tell anybody, because if you tell anybody, you're going to get even more punished. You're going to be hurt even worse, so don't say anything. Because parents themselves, within a few generations, were able to tell their own stories as well. And those who left the schools suffered significantly from unemployment and poverty. They certainly lost faith in the community that they came from and their families, lost trust in their families, and they lost a sense of belief about what the family unit is. You can't grow up in an institution and have a strong sense of family to begin with. Institutionalization of little children to the time that they're young adults would result in a loss of a sense of connection to family. And so as a result, knowing how to function within a family setting was a significant challenge for many of them. Language loss and cultural loss, identity loss were big, significant issues. And even those who were educated in the public schools underwent similar experiences. They didn't have the residential requirement component, but the public school system were educating children in the same way. They were telling children in residential schools that they were inferior, they were dirty, they were pagans and heathens. The same message was being conveyed in one form or the other to children in the public schools. And this has had the added impact of educating non-Aboriginal children to believe that their cultures, their ancestors, the people that they come from in Europe or other parts of the world were inherently superior to the indigenous people of this part of the world. And it has discouraged any effort to try to challenge that. And yet those who have been able to look at how cultures function and how societies functioned at the time of contact are able now to see more clearly than ever that in fact Aboriginal societies at the time of contact in some cases were far superior than the way that European societies were functioning. And the numbers of Aboriginal people far exceeded the numbers that people estimated over the years. Intergenerational survivors, the children of survivors, report common impacts upon their lives as a result of the residential school experience, lack of affection, lack of love between them and their parent. Parents talk about their inability to show love to their children, sometimes their fear of showing love. We've had more than one survivor tell us they were afraid to hold their child because when they held a child, they were reminded how they were held as a child by the person who abused them. And so that triggered something in them which made them want to not be accused of being an abuser, and as a result, holding children became an issue. And those of you who know the importance of early childhood early childhood development know the importance of holding infants and holding little children and the impact it has upon their, not only their social development and their sense of belonging, but also their impact upon their brain development. Substance abuse within the homes was a common report from intergenerational survivors, poverty as well, and poor and inconsistent child rearing and neglect in the homes as well, all of which are leading to higher apprehension rates. So the cycle of taking children away has now moved from residential schools into the child welfare system. Very clearly, a very clear connection there. In addition to that, individually, the survivors and their children suffered from, according to the mental health study that the Aboriginal Healing Foundation disclosed, from depression, sadness, criminal behavior, lack of support for education. So children who were trying to succeed in school didn't get support from their families because of a lack of respect for the system. Poor role modeling generally within their community has been reported by many intergenerational children. They didn't know their culture, they don't know their history, and they experience a lack of leadership. And so there's specific references here to particular diagnoses that have been discovered within those who went to residential schools, that in many cases has gone untreated, unidentified and untreated. And so as a result of that, we have a whole population of children and parents who have been suffering for many years, sometimes from generation to generation, with mental health issues that have not been taken properly into account. And so the question becomes now, what do we do about all of this? The first step is that we need to inform ourselves. We need to be aware of this as a real issue. And we need to understand that this is not an Aboriginal problem as well. That while those who were in the schools were victimized by their having been in the schools, those who didn't go to the schools and those who were part of the general Canadian society and educated in the public school system also were educated in a way that not only protected them from being treated in this way, but also treated them in a way which led to them believing in themselves and about Indigenous people in a negative manner, and about themselves in a mythologically positive manner. And so that's why we say that the secret to reconciliation going into the future is about how we educate our children to ensure that they have a proper foundation as they grow older of respect for each other that they can carry into their adult years. The education system holds the key to reconciliation, we believe, and that extends into post-secondary institutions as well. Because one of the keys, we think, is that we need to ensure that our professional people who are working within communities, and in particular those engaged in working with Aboriginal people, have a full appreciation of this history so that they know what it is they're dealing with. They know about this history enough to know how it impacts upon those who are before them, or those that they are treating, or those that they are working with or working for. And they can, of course, do their work better. It'll make them better professionals, but it'll also ensure that their clients get better service. In addition to that, post-secondary institutions, we believe, have a special role to play in ensuring that the academic freedom that they stand so proudly in defense of is extended to addressing the academic knowledge base about Indigenous people in all of these areas. We have identified weak areas of study in our report that we think will need to be addressed as we go forward. One of them would be, for example, about the issue of missing children. Children who are not able to make it home because they died in the schools, or perhaps because they ran away and died on their way home. We have attempted to discover as much as we can about the numbers of children that happened to. But our report is very incomplete. And we think there is a crying need for there to be more research into the question of how many children actually died in the schools, so that we can help the Aboriginal community and the non-Aboriginal community come to terms with this history in a truthful and meaningful way. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do because the ultimate goal of reconciliation for the Commission is about establishing a relationship of mutual respect. But we point out, before we can have that relationship of mutual respect, our first obligation is to ensure that young Indigenous people growing up are able to enjoy a process of gaining or regaining their sense of self-respect, their sense of pride in who they are, their sense of knowledge about where they come from, about who their heroes are and what they have accomplished, and about what their intended place was in this relationship so that they can claim it once again. The treaties were signed by the Indigenous leaders at the time for a reason and for a purpose. That purpose and reason was never respected by the government authorities. We say that. All others who have studied that process say that. We need to put that place back on the agenda in order to allow those young Indigenous people who were so well represented during the Idle No More process, to allow them to finally claim the place that their ancestors wanted them to occupy. So you need, in your fields of wherever endeavor you are, you need to do what you can to help them to do that. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the reconciliation journey. Can I ask you to all put up your hands if you make the commitment to carry on the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission by honoring the truth, committing to justice, and in a process, making this a country honorable and worthy of all of our children's dreams. I think the movement's begun, Justice. Would you like to have a seat and we'll ask it? We do have a chance for a couple of questions. We have until about 1:10 for questions. We would ask, you can say your question in whatever official language you're most comfortable, but please indicate your name and which language you'll be using so that if the Justice needs to switch over to the translation device, he has an opportunity to do so. I'd also ask that you restrict it to a short question. And if you have comments, if you could hold those until after the event. So there are microphones here, and there's also one over here, and we invite you to use them if you wish. And if you like, we could also bring the microphone to you to make this easier. So let's do that, because we have to be... There we are, Madam.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Ariel Court. I'm with the Canadian Peace Research Association, and I'm going to, of course, speak in English and make my comments that way. Thank you very much for what you have said and what you have showed to us. I feel particularly personal guilt for the terrible and continuing situation of the murder of Aboriginal women. It's going on. And I, as a woman, feel personally responsible for that. And I believe it is continuing and continuing. It happens again and again. I want to suggest it is our personal guilt. And it's not enough for us to say, what a crying shame. I am involved in that guilt. And I have to do my part to make the change that's essential. I think it's genocide continuing. Thank you very much.
Justice, any reflections on those comments?
One of the challenges we had as a commission as we were going through the work that we were doing was looking at the social conditions and the victimization rates that were going on in Canada, particularly one of which was the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and to assess the connection between that and residential schools or colonialism generally, because we need to keep in mind that residential schools cannot be looked at in isolation. They were part of an overall approach that government and Canadian society were taking to the forced assimilation of Indigenous people into Canadian society. And so the issue of victimization of women has a long history in Canadian nationalism. It goes back all the way back to the earliest days of the fur trade. The victimization of Indigenous women as, at a certain point in time almost came to be a normal course of things from the non-Aboriginal perspective. It was almost expected as of right that men would be, and non-Aboriginal men in particular, would be allowed to do this to Aboriginal women. And that belief has permeated the thinking of many men in Western Canadian society, in Western society generally. It's true in the United States as well, to think about Indigenous women as being less than their counterparts in non-Aboriginal society. And that was part of the colonial experience, the colonialism experience. It was also part of the residential school experience as well, because victimization of young girls in residential schools occurred at a much more significant rate than young boys, although victimization on both sides was quite serious. So it's natural to be able to conclude that there is that very clear connection. And so as a result of that, we have a recommendation.
Thank you. I believe we have another question. Whoops. Madam, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. What role do you foresee the church is playing in the reconciliation stage of this process? I guess in the ideal realm and what you suspect may happen.
The churches are at various levels of in the process of reconciliation, and we talk in our report at all of the efforts that we have identified, we have been told, and we have been able to identify on our own, that the churches have undertaken since the story of residential schools and the story of the involvement of churches in residential schools first became known and first became an issue, not just in the litigation process, but even before then. So apologies from churches go back to the 1960s, and church representatives of all faiths have made apologies in one form or the other at various levels about not only their involvement in residential schools, but their treatment of Indigenous people historically. So there is a papal apology, for example, from the Catholic Church in the 1960s, acknowledging that the church was involved and implicated in misconduct by people in its name going back to the 15th century. So that evidence is disclosed in our report, and we point out that it's there. One of the things that we say is important is that from time to time, if apologies are to be meaningful, they need to be recalled. You can't simply make an apology and then forget about it. If you make an apology and forget about it, then it has no meaning anymore. And so apologies need to be revived and need to be recalled, and almost in their own way need to be memorialized to become part of the national memory about things. And so we think that that process is important for all of the churches, and all of the churches have continued in one form or the other, again, at various levels. We haven't seen a papal apology lately. We think it might not be a bad idea. But there have been apologies from various entities in the other churches that we think need to be taken into account and need to be renewed. But apologizing is just part of the reconciliation process. Reconciliation involves also acknowledgement, and often apology comes from acknowledgement of the wrongs of the past. But if you move from acknowledgement to apology and nowhere else, then that's not going to get you reconciliation. You need to move to atonement, which means you have to do something to show that you're taking responsibility. And you have to alter your behavior. So altering of the behavior, you have to change the way you do business. If you don't change the way you do business, then you're going to continue to repeat what you did in the past. And so getting the churches in particular to recognize that they can continue to do their work without necessarily feeling that they have to call upon people to join the church is important. But also we think that they need to make a statement, and I've said this directly to the churches many times. I'm waiting to see the results. that they need to make a statement which shows that they have respect for Aboriginal spirituality on a par with their own respect for themselves and their respect for other spiritual belief systems around the world. And until they give respect to Aboriginal spirituality, those who have been victimized by residential schools will still feel that they need to continue to oppress their own cultural belief systems and keep their children from accessing that, and that's going to harm the children. So they need to do more work. Plus, I think there's lots of people in congregations that still don't understand the role of the churches in residential schools. Many churches have publicly acknowledged what they've done, but they haven't taken that knowledge and then taught it to their own congregations, which they need to do. Because otherwise, people from faith groups at the congregation level will continue to deny because no one's taught them. And they won't read our stuff and they won't listen to other people, but they will listen to their local church leaders. Well, financial compensation is already part of the settlement agreement process, so that goes without saying. But we need to be careful about compensation because in some ways compensation may be seen by some as being the end game of reconciliation, and it's not. Compensation can do harm in some cases if it's not properly handled. And in the case of the settlement agreement, for example, we know that many survivors feel that they have been re-victimized by their lawyers or by people who are representing them or by the adjudication process itself. It's odd that in a class action settlement agreement where the intention is to not require people to have to go to court, they have created a system requiring all survivors to have to go in front of another form of judge. And that shouldn't have been done. It should have been a more informal, more investigatory, more pro-survivor approach to the compensation process. Because if the intention was to safeguard them from further abuse, it's failed.
Unfortunately, that's the end of our time together. I do want to welcome you, please, to go to the TRC website, trc.ca, is that it, Justice?
That'll do it.
Where there are so many activities that you can learn and you can participate in the reconciliation spirit this week. And for those of you at the Congress bookstore, if you'd like to read about residential schools, this is John Malloy's book, A National Crime. It's available at the Manitoba Press section, so we recommend it to you. In closing, I just really want to respond to your call to action, Justice. The Federation of Humanities and Social Services really wants to join in this reconciliation movement, and to say some closing words about that, it's my honor to call up Antonio Meoni, the past president of the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences, to provide some closing remarks.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you very much, Cindy, for having helped as well organize this big thinking lecture. As Cindy said, I'm the past president of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences and a professor of political science at the Institute for Health and Social Policy at McGill University. Thank you again, Justice Sinclair, for your thought-provoking lecture. Merci infiniment de nous avoir aidé à voir grand sur cette question qui est une question pour tous les Canadiens à travers le pays. We as members of the Federation, and on a personal basis, want to respond by acknowledging your call to action. And so today, I am very happy to announce that the Federation's commitment to take up your call to work towards reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in Canada. Nous, à la Fédération, prenons acte de votre appel à l'action. À la fois sur le plan personnel et au nom de la Fédération, je suis heureuse d'annoncer aujourd'hui l'engagement de la Fédération dans la prise de mesures nécessaires pour la réconciliation entre les peuples autochtones et non autochtones au Canada. In fact, the Federation's board has recently adopted the Touchstones of Hope principles and processes to guide our work on reconciliation at the Federation and with our members. In this framework, we recognize that reconciliation is a movement, as you said so eloquently, that must be built and sustained over time. It is not an event, nor a short-term project. The 5 core touchstone principles that we will be recognizing include the recognition of Aboriginal self-determination, the need to take a holistic approach to promoting reconciliation, respecting Aboriginal cultures and languages, the need for structural interventions to address marginalization and historical wrongs, and non-discrimination, ensuring that non-Aboriginal staff and partners are supported in working in respectful ways. And to act on these principles, we engage ourselves to work through 4 key processes: relating and working respectively with Aboriginal communities, truth-telling, as we have heard again from Justice Sinclair, the actions of our work in the past and hearing about people's different truths and experiences, acknowledging, recognizing the need to move forward on this new path together, and restoring, doing what we can as a federation and with our members to redress the harm and prevent it in the future through vigilance in our practice. It's a very tall order, but this conversation is just beginning, particularly in terms of what reconciliation means for the Academy and for the role of its members in contributing to the teaching and research in Canada and beyond. As my colleague Cindy Blackstock mentioned, following today's Big Thinking lecture, we will continue that journey with an important panel discussion about how the Academy can join the growing social movement for reconciliation with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. The panel will take place at 1:30, just upstairs in the terminus room on the 2nd floor of the building, this building, the University Centre, and you can follow our great young volunteers to the stairs or elevators to reach it. En terminant, je souhaite remercier nos partenaires de la série Voir Grand, le Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines, l'Université Canada et la Fondation canadienne pour l'innovation. Je souhaite également exprimer ma gratitude envers notre hôte, l'Université d'Ottawa, de nous accueillir au cœur de la capitale nationale sur leur magnifique campus pour le Congrès 2015. This very powerful lecture kicks off the big thinking events throughout the week at the Congress. Tomorrow, for example, Joseph Yvon Thériault, the Canada Research Chair in Globalization, Citizenship and Democracy at the University of Quebec, Montreal, Université du Québec à Montréal, will be discussing with journalist Daniel Mathieu of Radio-Canada the current realities for francophones in the Americas. This is the kind of event that can bring us also to have a conversation about reconciliation. It will take place in French with simultaneous interpretation. Merci à vous tous dans l'auditoire et j'espère que vous allez prendre l'engagement qui nous a été lancé ce matin par le juge Sinclair. Thank you again to all of you here with us present to witness today the presentation from Justice Sinclair. And once again, thank you, Justice Sinclair, for your powerful and inspirational words. Bonne journée et bon congrès.